Every military analyst will tell you the same thing. On paper, the outcome is obvious. More soldiers, more aircraft, more missiles, more money. The bigger military wins. Except it doesn't. Vietnam defeated the United States. Afghanistan outlasted the Soviet Union, and then outlasted the United States. Finland held off the Soviet Union in 1939 with a fraction of the resources. North Vietnam had a GDP smaller than a single American aircraft carrier. It fought the most powerful military in history to a standstill. This isn't a series of anomalies. It's a pattern. And once you understand the pattern, the outcome of these conflicts stops being surprising. It becomes predictable. Here's how a small country defeats a superpower, broken down into the mechanics that actually determine the outcome, not the raw numbers every analyst leads with. The first thing to understand is what winning actually means, and why the definition is different for each side. This is the single most important concept in asymmetric warfare, and it's almost never explained clearly. For a superpower, winning means achieving something specific. Changing a government, stopping a weapons program, controlling a territory. There is an endpoint, a condition that, when reached, lets the military go home. For the smaller country, winning means something completely different. Not losing, just still being there when the superpower decides the cost isn't worth it anymore. One side needs to achieve something, the other side just needs to survive. Those are not the same game. Stay with me, because this reframes every conflict you've ever read about. When the United States entered Vietnam, the military objective was to prevent North Vietnam from unifying the country under communist control. Specific, measurable, achievable in theory. North Vietnam's objective was to survive American military engagement long enough for American domestic opinion to make continued commitment politically impossible. The American military won almost every major engagement. North Vietnam won the war, because they were playing a different game with a different goal, and they understood that definition more clearly than their opponent did. This is the first principle. Define victory as survival, not achievement. Make time your ally, not your enemy. Now here's the second principle, and this one explains the tactical side of how small countries fight. A superpower's military is built for a specific kind of war: conventional engagements, fixed front lines, identifiable targets, force-on-force battles where superior firepower and logistics determine the outcome. These assumptions are baked into the training, the equipment, the doctrine, the command structure. Everything about how a modern superpower fights is optimized for that kind of war. The small country fights a completely different kind of war. No fixed front lines, no identifiable targets, no conventional engagements where the superpower's advantages are decisive. Instead, dispersion, ambiguity, patience, making the environment itself a weapon. The Viet Cong didn't fight the American military in open terrain where firepower decided everything. They fought in jungle, in tunnels, in villages. They moved at night. They disappeared into the civilian population. They attacked and were gone before a response could be organized. The American military spent years trying to apply conventional solutions to that problem. It didn't work, not because American soldiers were less capable, because the battlefield itself had been designed to make their capabilities irrelevant. This is the second principle. Don't fight the war your opponent prepared for. Fight the war that makes their preparation irrelevant. And this scales down to tactics. The IRA didn't fight the British Army in open confrontation. They used Belfast itself as the weapon. Alleyways, civilian cover, knowledge of every exit route that the British military didn't have. The British Army spent years adapting to an environment where its training was useless. Every adaptation took time. Time that an opponent with a different definition of victory uses better than a military with a fixed deployment calendar. Stay with me, because the third principle is where the economics of small country warfare become decisive. A superpower projects military power at enormous cost. Every soldier deployed abroad requires food, equipment, medical support, communication, and protection. Every aircraft requires fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and base infrastructure. Every ship requires a port, a crew, a supply chain that stretches back thousands of miles. The cost of maintaining a military presence in a foreign country is exponentially higher than the cost of fighting in your own territory. In Vietnam, the United States spent approximately $840 billion in today's dollars. North Vietnam spent a fraction of that, and China and the Soviet Union covered much of even that fraction. The math was never going to work in America's favor. Every dollar North Vietnam spent forced the United States to spend 10 times more. That arithmetic doesn't care about aircraft carriers. This is called asymmetric cost exchange, and it is the economic engine that makes long conflicts unsustainable for superpowers. The small country doesn't need to win the military exchange. It needs to make the military exchange expensive enough that the superpower's domestic population asks the question that ends every unsustainable war. What exactly are we getting for this? That question has ended every unsustainable war in modern history: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. The public doesn't need to oppose the war on principle. It just needs to stop believing the cost is justified by the outcome. And the moment that happens, the moment the political math shifts, the military operation becomes impossible to sustain regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. North Vietnam understood this better than the American political establishment did. Ho Chi Minh said it explicitly: "You can kill 10 of our men for every one of yours, and you will still lose, because we will outlast your will to continue." He was right. Not because of superior tactics, because of superior understanding of what the conflict was actually about. Here's where the fourth principle comes in, and it's the one that ties everything together. Superpowers fight with their militaries. Small countries fight with their entire societies. This distinction sounds obvious. It has enormous practical consequences that get underestimated almost every time. When Finland fought the Soviet Union in 1939, it wasn't just the Finnish military resisting. It was everything: the terrain, the climate, the Finnish knowledge of every frozen lake, every forest path, every route that Soviet maps got wrong. Finnish soldiers fought in conditions that made Soviet armor useless. The Soviets had more of everything that shows up in a military comparison. Finland had the ground, and the ground decided the outcome. The Soviets had more of everything. Finland had home advantage, and used it to impose costs that forced the Soviet Union to negotiate rather than continue. This pattern repeats in every successful small country resistance. The Taliban in Afghanistan had no air force, no artillery, no advanced communications, no logistics chain comparable to NATO's. They had 20 years, and they had the knowledge that the foreign military would eventually go home, because foreign militaries always go home. They have domestic constituencies, they have budget cycles, they have election cycles, they have a population that will eventually lose patience. The Taliban just had to outlast that moment. Now put all four principles together, because this is where the pattern becomes a strategy. Define victory as survival. Fight the war your opponent didn't prepare for. Impose asymmetric economic costs. Use your entire society, not just your military. Applied consistently, these principles create a situation where the superpower's military advantages, the things that make it look invincible on the comparison charts, become liabilities rather than assets. More soldiers means more supply lines to protect. More aircraft means more maintenance infrastructure to defend. More advanced equipment means more technical complexity that breaks down in environments it wasn't built for. More firepower means more civilian casualties that erode the domestic support, keeping the whole operation funded. The strengths become the vulnerabilities. The superpower's strengths create the vulnerabilities the small country exploits. This is why the pattern keeps repeating. It's not that superpowers are incompetent. The American military is extraordinarily capable. The Soviet military was one of the most formidable forces ever assembled. The problem is structural. A military built and optimized for one kind of war, deployed into a different kind of war, operated by a political system with a finite tolerance for cost and time, against an opponent with a different definition of victory and an unlimited tolerance for both. The outcome isn't guaranteed, but it's not a surprise either. The small country wins when it applies these principles consistently, and the superpower fails to adapt before domestic political pressure forces a withdrawal. There are cases where superpowers do adapt. The British counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya in the 1950s is the textbook example. Population protection, intelligence-driven operations, political accommodation alongside military pressure. It worked. But Malaya required specific conditions that rarely exist: a geographically contained conflict, a clear political alternative that the population could be offered, time to adapt before domestic opinion turned. Most conflicts don't offer those conditions. Most conflicts offer a superpower its standard toolkit, deployed against a problem that the standard toolkit wasn't designed to solve, with a clock running on domestic political tolerance that the smaller side understands better than the larger one does. The superpower wins when it either adapts fast enough to fight the actual war rather than the planned war, or changes the political calculation so that the small country's definition of victory becomes unachievable. That second path is rare. Changing the political calculation of a population fighting in its own territory for its own survival against what it perceives as a foreign occupier is one of the hardest things a military power has ever attempted. It has almost never worked, which is why the same conflicts keep ending the same way, and why the next time someone tells you a conflict is over before it starts because one side has more soldiers, more aircraft, more missiles, the question worth asking isn't whether those numbers are accurate. They probably are. The question is which game each side is actually playing, because if the smaller side understands what winning actually means for them and builds a strategy around making the superpower's strengths irrelevant instead of trying to match them, those numbers stop mattering. Time becomes the most important variable, and time historically has not favored the bigger side. It has favored the side that was still there.